Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to give you that shortcut to being really well informed without you having to sift through mountains of text. Today we're looking at a fascinating stack of articles you provided, all from the same publication, but wow, they cover a lot of ground. We're talking global conflict, snail shells, communication, personal stuff. Our mission, as always, is to explore these sources, pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and see how it all connects.
It really is a fascinating mix, isn't it? The sources touch on some heavy topics like the roots of conflict and how people might change, but then also everyday things like how we talk to each other. And then there's nature, resilience, and families, even how weather can, totally change history. Plus, faith, community, security. It's going to be interesting to see how these different threads weave together.
Definitely. So let's jump right into that first big theme from the sources. The whole complex issue of terrorism. Why does it happen? What's driving it? The articles kick off with Andre's story from Namibia. It's really powerful. He talks about being at the post office, seeing this bag, deciding to leave. Just minutes before it exploded, he describes the shock. The trauma lasted over 25 years, he said. Seeing the aftermath, knowing people who died, realizing how close he came.
That story really hits hard. It underlines the devastation. And the sources, they immediately try to unpack the motivations behind such acts. They suggest it's often tied to these really deep feelings of oppression and a strong desire for revenge. You see that with Joseba in Spain. The articles link his actions to what he saw as police brutality. And Hafeni, growing up in refugee camps, fueled by anger over how his family was treated, their land taken. The sources even bring in Mark Juergensmeyer talking about how terrorists versus freedom fighters often about perspective and how these acts target non-combatants deliberately, for dramatic effect to create fear.
And religion comes into it too, according to the articles. There's a quote from a militant spokesman saying he was in service of God. And authors Benjamin and Simon noted how, as the world gets maybe more religious in some ways, some groups are putting violence right at the center of their beliefs.
Right, but here's a really crucial point the sources make. They stress that the extreme views of many militants don't actually reflect the traditional teachings of the religions they claim to represent. They mention a 20-year review concluding that the real struggle isn't just military or political. It's described as being for hearts and minds.
Okay, so if it's about hearts and minds,
Yeah.
how can that kind of deep-seated hatred, those feelings of revenge, how can they actually change? This is where it gets really interesting in the sources. They tell the stories of Hafeni and Joseba. Hafeni, who was so angry about his family, he started looking into his own beliefs.
Yeah, their articles say he began reading the Bible, specifically the Gospels and the Book of Acts. And through that, he came to see tribalism, nationalism, prejudice as human things, not from God. That having God's approval was what mattered most.
And Joseba, he was actually planning an attack, right?
Yeah.
After being abused himself.
Exactly. But the sources say he also started studying the Bible later on. He was really struck by what Jesus said in Matthew, all those who take the sword will perish by the sword, in toll. That principle, the sources explain, helped him see that violence just leads to more pain, more revenge. The articles point to the Bible itself, describing it as alive and exerts power, able to see the intentions of the heart. And they present this as the key factor that helped people like Hafeni and Joseba change their thinking, their actions.
And this change, the sources connected to finding a sort of brotherhood based on love and taking a neutral stance.
Precisely. They reference Jesus' teachings about his followers loving one another, that being their identifying mark, and also his statement about them being no part of the world, which the sources link to staying out of political and military conflicts. They contrast this sharply with World War I, pointing out how Christian nations fought each other. They even quote a clergyman, Harry Emerson Fosdick, who criticized churches back then for glorifying war instead of following Jesus' example of peace.
And there was a study mentioned from the 70s.
Yeah, a sociological study from 1975 cited in the articles. It noted the consistent nonviolent stance of Jehovah's Witnesses, their Christian neutrality, through major wars. The study attributed this to how strongly they held to their understanding of the Bible. The sources even quote a former Belgian prime minister who apparently felt applying Jesus' principles could end terrorism, though he called it wishful thinking, practically speaking.
And bringing it back to the personal stories, Andre, the man who survived the bombing.
He was able, according to the sources, to apply the Bible's advice about freely forgiving, found in Colossians.
And Hafeni, the one whose group was involved in that bombing.
He renounced violence based on principles like the one in Psalm 11, and the articles state that both men, Andre and Hafeni, later became Jehovah's Witnesses. And now, incredibly, they work together in the same translation office. Talk about overcoming hate.
Wow. Oh.
So this whole section really uses these powerful personal accounts to explore where conflict comes from. And then it presents a very specific view drawn from these articles on how interchange, based on applying these Bible principles, is shown as a way people have managed to leave hatred and violence behind.
Okay, let's completely switch gears now. The sources also offer insights into something we all deal with every day. Communication, how we talk, how we interact. There's an article, Why Your Speech Matters, and it kicks off with this really striking anecdote. A prime minister loses an election just days after some off-mic comments he made about an elderly woman got picked up by a reporter. The point the sources make is crystal clear. Words matter. A lot.
That's a pretty stark example, isn't it? It shows how even casual words can have huge consequences. The sources really emphasize that speech is like a window into the inner person. It shows what we're thinking, feeling, our emotions. They reference a principle in Matthew about that. So the argument is, if you want to improve your speech, you actually need to work on how you think. They bring up that advice from Philippians. Focus your mind on things that are true, serious, righteous, chaste, lovable, well spoken of. Basically, good stuff.
So feed your mind positive things. Avoid the negative, like violent entertainment.
Exactly. They specifically mention avoiding violent or obscene entertainment, citing principles from Psalms and Ephesians. And they recommend passages in Proverbs, Ephesians, and James as guides for cultivating better speech habits.
So it's not just about what you say, but what's going on inside that shapes it.
Precisely. And filtering words is key. They quote Proverbs. There exists the one speaking thoughtlessly, as with the stabs of a sword, but the tongue of the wise ones is a healing. Powerful contrast there. Another proverb says the righteous heart meditates before answering. So thinking before speaking.
Any other practical tips from the sources on speech?
Yeah, a couple more. Praying for help to use speech well, reflecting the idea in Psalm 19. And using the Bible like a mirror, that concepts from James, to really look at your own speech patterns, honestly. The articles suggest asking yourself some pointed questions. Do I speak mildly, peacefully, like Proverbs suggests?
Does my speech build others up, like Ephesians encourages? Is it gracious, as Colossians mentions? Things like that.
And moving beyond just speech, the sources tackle how can I make a good first impression? They highlight how important that is for jobs, making friends, even finding a partner. They start with this example of a job applicant who blew it dressed too casually, got too familiar too quickly, even bad body language.
Okay, so how do you make a good impression, according to these articles? They break it down.
Yeah, into three main areas. First, how you look. Appearance is the first thing noticed. Should be appropriate for the situation, avoid extremes. When in doubt, lean conservative. They quote someone named Diane saying, dress reflects the inner person, and reference 1 Timothy on modest, sound-minded dress.
Okay, appearance first. What's next?
Second, what you say. Your speech reveals your personality. Are you humble or conceited? Easygoing or, desperate? The advice is, don't talk too much, but don't talk too little either. Avoid prying or saying offensive things. They quote peers named Valerie and Selena and cite Proverbs again about being sensible with words.
Makes sense. Look good, sound good.
Yeah.
That's the third.
Third, how you act. Actions speak volumes, like a billboard showing your inner qualities, the sources say. Good manners show respect. Being a good listener is crucial. Don't interrupt. Be reliable. Be punctual. They quote Carrie and Natalia here, and they bring up that principle from Luke. Treat others how you want to be treated. Practical tip. Arrive a bit early for appointments.
Right, but they also warn against just putting on an act, right?
Absolutely. A key caution in the sources is not to create a facade. They link that to deception, referencing a psalm. The emphasis is on cultivating the actual qualities from the inside out, a transformation process mentioned in Colossians. Basically, be the creator of your own genuine reputation. It loops back to speech reflecting the heart. True change starts inside. So this section really gives some solid, actionable advice for navigating social stuff effectively, all based on the source material.
Okay, let's shift again. Now exploring resilience. We see it in nature and human experience, and also the impact of big external forces, like weather. Starting with that, was it designed? Piece on the scaly foot snail. This thing lives in the deep ocean. Heat, pressure, acid, crazy environment. Yet it has one of the toughest shells out there.
It's incredible. The sources explain its unique 3-layer shell. Outer layer, iron sulfides. Middle layer, sort of protein-like. Inner layer, aragonite. This triple defense protects it from crabs trying to crush it. And Discover magazine is quoted describing this amazing mechanism in the outer layer, microcracking. It cracks in tiny ways that actually absorb energy and stop bigger cracks from forming. The middle layer absorbs impacts, too.
Microcracking, that's brilliant. So it's not just hard, it's designed to handle stress. And researchers are actually studying it to copy it for helmets, vests, pipelines.
Yeah, that's what the source says, which leads directly to that question they pose. Did this intricate system just happen by chance, or was it designed?
A fascinating question. And then the sources contract this natural resilience with forces humans can't control, like weather, showing how it can literally change history.
Exactly. Big, unpredictable events.
Like the Spanish Armada in 1588, the sources describe how English fire ships, helped by wind and currents, panicked the Spanish near Calais,
causing them to cut their anchor cables to escape, a fateful decision. Because later, off Ireland, a massive Atlantic storm hit them. Without anchors, the sources say 26 ships were wrecked, thousands died. They even quote that Dutch metal struck at the time. Jehovah blew and they were scattered. Shows how people saw it back then.
Wow. And the other example was Waterloo, 1815.
Right. A massive rainstorm the night before turned the battlefield into a total quagmire. This delayed Napoleon's attack plans for hours, the sources explain.
And the mud, it affected his cannons.
Hugely. His artillery was less effective, cannonballs didn't travel as far, or, crucially, didn't ricochet through enemy lines like they usually did in dry conditions. The sources argue this was disastrous for Napoleon, a big factor in his defeat and exile. And they explicitly link these weather events, the Armada storm, the Waterloo mud, to helping the rise of the British Empire.
Incredible how weather played such a role.
Man.
Shifting to human resilience, there's that article, Raising a Child with Down Syndrome. It opens by describing the experience as an emotional roller coaster, soaring highs, plummeting lows.
Yeah. The sources define Down syndrome, or DS, as this lifelong genetic thing, an extra chromosome 21, leads to varying degrees of difficulty with learning, language, motor skills, slower maturity. But, and this is stressed, every child is unique. They can absolutely live fulfilling lives. They quote Jason, who has DS, saying it's a disability for learning slowly, but it's not that bad. Great perspective.
What of the parents? The sources describe their initial reaction.
Oh, yeah. Shock, grief, maybe even dread or rejection initially. They cite Wachter and Lisa's experiences, but then they show how parents adapt, like Alina, who decided to focus on her daughter Susanna's progress after some simple words from her child brought so much joy.
And the key to success, according to the sources.
Love. Straight up. One quote is, start by loving them. Everything else comes after that. They also emphasize integrating the child into all family activities, using early intervention programs, physiotherapy, speech therapy, play therapy to build skills. Gonzalo's experience with Susanna is mentioned. And teaching pre-language skills, like simple signs, Lisa did that with her daughter Jasmine.
Mainstream schooling is mentioned too, for integration.
Yes, the sources see value there for social interaction, even if progress is slower academically. Francisco talks about his daughter Yolanda in that context.
It sounds like a lot of work, though. Time, effort.
Definitely. The sources acknowledge the sacrifice, quoting Soledad about caring for her daughter Anna, but they really highlight the profound rewards. Stronger family bonds, siblings learning empathy and patience. They mention Antonio and Maria with Marta, and Rosa with Susanna. And that feeling of getting love back double, as Elena described with Susanna. They also reiterate that people with DS keep growing and learning their whole lives, quoting Emily and Barbara again. It ends with Yolanda's simple, powerful advice to parents. Love him very much, and don't forget to be patient. So this section really paints a picture of resilience on different levels, from intricate natural design to the incredible strength and love within families facing big challenges.
Okay, let's turn to Murat Ibatulin's story now. Something more precious than our life now. Russian neurosurgeon. His journey touches on faith, community, even applying beliefs in medicine. Grew up in a mainly Muslim family, but parents were communists, atheists. He wasn't religious, but was critical of communism.
Right. And his search for meaning intensified when he was working as a doctor in Uganda, doing tough surgeries, even with HIV patients. The article says he started looking into religion, then tried reading a Russian Bible, studied the Quran.
And this led him to meet Jehovah's Witnesses, Heinz and Marianne Wertholz.
Exactly. Even though he'd heard negative things, he and his wife Dilbar read their literature. And the reaction was powerful. Dilbar was apparently so thrilled she had goosebumps. Murat felt the same.
So they became witnesses, before going back to Russia.
Yes, in 1991, which created a challenge when they got back to Kazan finding other witnesses. The sources describe how they initially just started sharing their beliefs themselves, going door to door, starting studies. Eventually, they connected with a small group, and it grew rapidly from 15 to multiple congregations in Kazan. Murat even played a role in getting literature translated into Tatar after he mentioned the need when visiting the world headquarters.
And a big part of his story is this bloodless medicine aspect. What's that about?
The articles explain it's tied to the witness's understanding of Bible texts, like in the book of Acts, about abstaining from blood. So they seek medical treatments that avoid blood transfusions. The sources mention hospital liaison committees, groups that help patients and doctors find these alternative methods.
And there's an example given.
A really striking one. A 1-year-old boy, Pavel, in 1997, needed complex heart surgery. Murat and others helped find a clinic in Kazan willing to do it bloodlessly, which was pretty rare then. It was successful. The newspaper report quoted said Pavel felt all right afterward. The articles mention he's healthy and active today. Murat, now a neuroradiologist and professor, continues to advocate for these techniques.
So for Murat and his wife, the satisfaction isn't just medical work.
No, the source emphasizes they find deep satisfaction in seeing what they call Bible truths heal people spiritually, and sharing the hope found in Isaiah about a future time when no resident will say, "I am sick." It's presented as a story of significant personal change, where faith deeply influences life, work, and hope for the future.
And finally, there's a piece on Hafeni, Georgia,
Yeah.
the land of the watchtowers. Sounds picturesque, but rugged.
Very much so. Remote, mountainous region, famous for these ancient stone towers, the Merkvam connected to houses, the core.
What was the story behind the towers?
Historically, the sources explain, the Swans were isolated by the mountains, fiercely independent. The towers were essential protection against invaders, feuding neighbors, even avalanches. Life involved constant readiness. The towers were for storage, but also fighting platforms. Arms were always ready, especially in the 19th century when there wasn't much central authority. Physical fortresses were a necessity for survival.
But the source contrasts that historical reality with something else.
Exactly. It contrasts that past need for physical watchtowers and fortifications with a different vision of security presented as a future prospect. It links this to a promise in the Bible book of Micah about people sitting securely, each one under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one making them afraid. This promise is also connected to the idea of freedom from suffering found in Romans. So it uses this specific place and its history to contrast a past reality of needing physical defenses with a different kind of future peace and security described in these sources.
Wow. Okay, that really was a deep dive. We went from the roots of conflict and personal change to amazing snail shells, weather shaping history, how to talk to people, making good impressions, the resilience of families dealing with Down syndrome, and these different views on faith, community, security, and the future.
It's incredible how exploring these diverse sources all from one place really does show connections. You get such a wealth of insight into, the human condition, the world, just from digging into this material you shared.
So after covering all that ground, what does this mean for you, the listener, as you reflect on all these different pieces?
Well, this deep dive, based entirely on these articles, has laid out a whole range of challenges people face: violence, conflict, personal struggles, unpredictable nature. But alongside those challenges, it's presented different ways people find security, resilience, hope. Whether that's through natural adaptations like the snail, or profound personal change like Hafeni and Joseba, or community support, or the specific faith perspective shown in Murat's story and the hope for the future mentioned, it presents various paths people have taken towards safety and peace. So maybe the question for you is, considering all these varied perspectives on security and overcoming adversity we've just talked about, drawn from these sources, where might you look for resilience and peace in your own life?
Definitely something to think about. Until our next deep dive.